They never saw the collapse coming. Not like this, not from the inside. What once looked like a coordinated strike against your destiny has now crumbled into a scene of chaos they can't explain. The architects of your downfall are standing in the ruins of their own intentions, dazed by the very force they thought they could command. Their calculations, their strategies, all unraveled in silence, leaving them bewildered by a downfall that didn't follow any earthly logic. They assumed they were the authors of this narrative. But control was never theirs to begin with. The darkness that whispered instructions into their ears was never their ally, it was their handler. They weren't leading an ambush, they were being led to the edge of a precipice, one blind step at a time. And now they're caught in the aftermath of a fall they never even prepared for. There's no recovering from a collapse built into the blueprint. But to make sense of this unraveling, you have to rewind. Not to the moment they attacked, but to the silent shift that set this reckoning in motion. Only by retracing the arc of divine reversal can you begin to grasp how deeply protected your life has always been, and how badly they misunderstood the consequences of touching what was never theirs to handle. There's a reason some faces changed without warning, why familiar voices suddenly carried an unfamiliar chill. This shift didn't emerge out of nowhere. It began quietly, almost invisibly, through subtle distortions of truth that found their way into hearts already leaning toward bitterness. Certain individuals didn't need to be convinced. They were simply waiting for a justification to act on feelings they were too proud to admit. What approached them didn't scream or demand. It only echoed what they already believed in secret. A gentle nudge here, a seductive confirmation there, and the descent began. Not random, not chaotic, chosen carefully, because their hunger for validation made them easy to use. That flicker of discontent when your life started to evolve? It didn't go unnoticed. That ache of inadequacy they never addressed? It became a fertile ground. A silent force leaned into it, stretching every comparison, twisting every insecurity, until they could no longer tell the difference between your growth and their failure. And once their hearts were sufficiently agitated, the bait appeared, crafted to match their individual ache. Some were lured by control, others by the illusion of justice. A few simply craved your silence. They accepted the invisible exchange without question, each one believing they were finally getting what they deserved. But beneath every offer was a hidden arrangement, a surrender masked as opportunity. None of them paused long enough to see the price tag tucked beneath their temporary reward. Their focus was narrow, their desire louder than discernment. And while they imagined themselves rising, something else took root. Authority slipped quietly from their hands, replaced by a leash they couldn't feel until it tightened. And the most ironic truth? The trap was never meant to stop you. The storm circling your life wasn't a mission, it was a study. They weren't recruited to win a war. They were enlisted to expose how impossible it is to destroy someone who's been assigned a calling beyond comprehension. They were never recruited for victory, they were bait for a pattern analysis. Every attempt made against your path was never about destroying you. It was about testing the reach of the unseen barrier that surrounds you. The adversary has long been mapping the boundaries of spiritual insulation. Curious, not hopeful, calculating, not confident. So when the schemes were set in motion, when the sabotage quietly launched from behind familiar faces, there was no expectation of success. Only observation. The chaos they stirred was never about breaking you. It was about measuring the recoil. They plotted, they moved in sync, unaware they were performing in a rehearsed failure. The backdoor deals, the silent betrayals, the whispered alliances, they were all logged like data points in a failed simulation. When they tried to isolate you, what followed was not collapse, but acceleration. When they tampered with your name, they only increased its weight. When they reached for what was never theirs, it evaporated in their hands. They watched, helpless, as what should have worked on anyone else unraveled into their own undoing. Each calculation they made assumed your light could be dimmed, and each result proved how wrong they were. But the real spiral began after the dust refused to settle. Their own stability began to deteriorate, not through loud events, but through a quiet pattern of erosion. What once felt guaranteed started slipping through the cracks. Resources evaporated, bonds dissolved, influence scattered. Not by coincidence, but by design. A price they never read aloud began deducting from every area of their lives. And still, they couldn't connect the dots. Because when you tamper with the sacred without clearance, you don't just lose the battle. You forfeit everything protecting your own house. The debt wasn't paid with regret. It was collected through systematic disassembly. And the collector never forgets a signature. The most dangerous transformation isn't always visible. It vibrates beneath the skin. When certain individuals accepted the invitation to interfere with your path, they didn't just agree to play a role in a scheme. They allowed their essence to be recalibrated into something corrosive. From that moment on, they didn't need to act to cause harm. Simply existing in their new spiritual frequency began warping everything around them. They turned into conduits for disruption, transmitting chaos into every room they entered, infecting atmospheres without speaking a word. The damage wasn't limited to their intentions. Those closest to them, their homes, their children, their hopes, began absorbing the fallout. Not because they were targeted, but because they were nearby. Darkness doesn't aim. It seeps. It stains. And it consumes by proximity. Every promise they once held, every dream they'd nurtured in private, began to falter under the weight of the invisible toll they'd agreed to carry. What they thought was an isolated strike ended up becoming a full invasion, not of your life, but of their own. And still, many believed it was just a phase. They reassured themselves that the turbulence would pass, that the strange timing of losses and misfortunes was circumstantial. But the truth was never temporary. The pact they entered wasn't a favor, it was a trade. And what was taken from them wasn't just time or luck, it was access. Access to peace, to protection, to clarity. As they watched their resources thin and their circles shrink, they searched for reasons that made sense on paper. But no logic could account for the precise unraveling they were experiencing. Their downfall didn't roar. It whispered. A strange diagnosis on a random Tuesday. A long-term partnership that cracked without warning. Doors that had always been open now mysteriously sealed. Each event felt unrelated, until the pattern emerged. The very hands they once raised against your name were now empty. And the silence they mistook for your weakness turned out to be the shield that made their efforts collapse into themselves. Because once corruption enters a soul, it doesn't wait for permission to spread. Some people mistook your silence for indifference, but your spirit was busy doing diagnostics. What they didn't realize is that every movement, every shift in their tone, every flicker of intent was being scanned by something deeper than logic. Before their actions ever took shape, a quiet signal had already reached your awareness. Their energy started triggering quiet alarms, not through evidence, but through resonance. Certain interactions felt heavier. Some conversations felt colder than they should have. You weren't imagining it. You were detecting a spiritual misalignment so stark it could no longer hide behind smiles or familiar roles. You didn't retreat out of pride. You were moved by instinct that doesn't negotiate. You began turning down invites without knowing why. You stopped oversharing. You shortened phone calls. Not because you held a grudge, but because the atmosphere began to feel distorted in ways your soul could no longer tolerate. And while they chalked it up to ego or distance, something far more precise was happening. You weren't leaving them behind. You were being extracted. There was a quiet authority at work, pulling your path away from anyone whose hidden intentions would have poisoned your peace if left unchecked. And this separation created a haunting realization they couldn't shake. They couldn't explain how you kept slipping away right before they were ready to strike. How your trust evaporated before their betrayal had a chance to take root. It maddened them, this sense that you were always a step ahead, always shielded from their most calculated efforts. They watched as the blueprint of their sabotage fell apart in real time. But the real agony wasn't in the failure. It was in the visibility. They had to watch you flourish. Had to watch everything they secretly hoped would collapse, ascend instead. And in that bitter clarity, they finally understood they weren't leading anything. They were part of a narrative they'd never been authorized to write. They assumed they were sent to disrupt your alignment, when in fact, they were part of a self-destruct protocol. The real experiment wasn't about breaking your path. It was about exposing theirs. What was activated through their decisions wasn't warfare against you. It was a mirror reflecting back every dormant fracture in their own soul. They didn't know that their fixation was being weaponized, not for your harm, but for the unmaking of their own delusions. What began as an attack ended up being an unveiling, one they couldn't stop once it was set in motion. At first, they were simply confused. They checked their efforts like architects surveying a failing blueprint. How could something so calculated fall apart so effortlessly? The more their tactics collapsed, the more their frustration grew. They interpreted resistance as a challenge, pushed harder, recruited louder voices, sharpened old alliances. But what they couldn't see was that every escalation increased the extraction rate on their own stability. They weren't advancing. They were depleting themselves faster. And the collapse didn't just stay with them, it spread through their connections like circuitry shorting out. Every person drawn into the chaos became part of the fallout. Agreements that were whispered in confidence began echoing into consequences. Associates lost credibility. Loved ones turned on each other. Opportunities that should have opened began vanishing before arrival. And still, they didn't realize they were footing the bill for a design that was never meant to serve them. What they thought was a coalition became a burden pyramid. Each new conspirator another weight stacked onto a foundation already cracking beneath its own spiritual debt. And at the very bottom stood the ones who started it all, now crushed beneath the very structure they imagined would elevate them. Some people misread the consequences of their own actions as signs of your retaliation, but nothing could be further from the truth. As misfortunes began to shadow those entangled in the schemes against you, the pattern should have been obvious. One after another, they stumbled into sudden setbacks, strange turns of fate that defied logic. But instead of stepping back and questioning their alignment, they doubled down. Their egos convinced them you must be the one orchestrating their downfall, unaware they were being crushed under the weight of their own agreements. The collapse wasn't punishment, it was echo. A vibration triggered by the laws they'd quietly violated. The more chaotic things became, the more irrational their reactions turned. Some crossed into realms they never believed in, thinking they'd find leverage where none existed. They flirted with rituals they didn't respect, called on forces they didn't understand, and opened spiritual channels without safeguards. They weren't summoning power, they were surrendering control. And what they invited in didn't fight for them. It harvested from them. Their spiritual balance sheet spiraled deeper into deficit with every move. What was meant to give them advantage left them more fragmented than before. Others took a colder route, convinced they could overpower sacred laws with calculation. They began operating like tacticians, mapping your behavior, dissecting your relationships, constructing systems to exploit what they saw as weak spots. It wasn't emotion, it was obsession masked as strategy. They believed they could engineer your collapse through timing and manipulation. But what they underestimated was how deeply your life is woven into timing they don't govern. They were playing chess against a player who wrote the board. And every clever move they made just revealed how far outside their authority they were operating. The illusion of power faded slowly, but painfully. They couldn't understand how each attempt to corner you only resulted in more visibility, more acceleration, more resilience. What they called resistance was actually immunity. What they assumed was offense was spiritual reflection. And all the while, they missed the truth staring them down. No one had lifted a hand against them. They had walked willingly into their own unraveling. Not because you fought back, but because what they tried to fight was never yours to begin with. It was an order they were never licensed to touch. The spiral reached its final descent the moment fear replaced their illusion of control. As your light continued to stretch higher, their world began collapsing inward. In desperation, some attempted to sever ties with the very force they once welcomed, hoping a last-minute retreat would undo what had already been set in motion. But the agreements they made weren't casual pacts. They were soul-level exchanges sealed by intention. And those don't expire with regret. Others, more reckless, pushed harder, mistaking the void for opportunity. Every extreme act they committed was a cry for reversal, but instead, they were pulled deeper into a current designed to devour the ones who resist correction. Clarity didn't come gently. It shattered through like a sudden break in silence. They saw, finally, what they had signed up for. Not as warriors in a noble mission, but as offerings in a trade they barely understood. The ruin they believed was meant for someone else had always been aimed at them. They had not been betrayed by a lie. They had been fulfilled by a truth they refused to see. The demolition wasn't malicious. It was mathematical. A return equal to the energy they gave permission to flow through them. And once that realization settled in, it echoed through every collapsed piece of their lives. But the harshest truth came from the quiet memories they could no longer ignore. They began to remember who you were, before the shift, before the bitterness, before they let distortion infect their view. You weren't their adversary. You weren't even their competition. You were just moving forward while they chose to remain still. And your movement exposed their silence. Every layer of your transformation reminded them of everything they refused to confront in themselves. The path you walked was never built to provoke them, but it illuminated the weight of their excuses like a spotlight in a dark room. That's what truly unsettled them. You didn't attack, they felt attacked anyway. Because your growth made their stagnation impossible to ignore. Your healing mocked their pain, not with cruelty, but with contrast. You didn't humiliate them. You simply evolved. But in their mind, every step you took toward wholeness felt like a verdict. Each boundary you honored whispered what they could no longer deny. Your exit wasn't abandonment. It was alignment. And the reason it cut so deep is because they knew they could have chosen that path too. They didn't lose you. They lost themselves long before you ever walked away. Some people don't realize that when someone close to them grows, it creates an opening, not a threat. They misinterpret transformation as betrayal, forgetting that expansion can be shared, not stolen. Your progress could have been a map, a torch passed silently in the night to light their own way. But they saw movement and assumed distance. They saw your evolution and heard rejection. Instead of stepping into the current and letting it pull them forward, they tried to dam the flow, believing if you stayed still, they wouldn't have to confront their own stagnation. And when you kept rising, they didn't see opportunity, they saw offense. Your breakthrough became a mirror they weren't ready to face. The gap widened not because you pushed them away, but because they refused to rise with you. It was never about what you took. It was about what you revealed. You showed them that the walls they lived behind weren't real, that the chains they carried were unlocked. And instead of dropping the weight and walking with you, they turned around and tried to silence the messenger. But as time passed and their own choices bore fruit, a bitter clarity began to set in. They began to recall how safe your presence once felt, how your loyalty never asked for payment, how you held space for them even when they couldn't hold space for themselves. What now looked like a threat used to feel like home. And in that contradiction, the truth started bleeding through. You hadn't changed in a way that harmed them. They had simply chosen to interpret your growth as abandonment rather than invitation. The worst pain came not from what they lost, but from what they could have had. Everything they resented in you, your strength, your insight, your refusal to stay small, wasn't a weapon. It was a bridge. And had they chosen humility over hostility, They could have crossed it with you. But they tried to tear it down instead. And with every board they ripped from the foundation, they moved further from their own breakthrough. The irony was unbearable. They had fought the one person who embodied the change they secretly craved. And when their plans failed, some didn't return to reconcile, they returned to negotiate. Not with honesty, but with manipulation dressed as regret. Their words weren't rooted in healing, but in survival. They hoped you still had a soft place for them to land. But compassion isn't blind, and time had given you clarity they weren't prepared for. What they had once mistaken as your weakness, your heart, was now fortified. Not cold, but clear. Not bitter, but boundaried. And while forgiveness is always possible, access is a privilege that cannot be faked. They hadn't been cut off by your progress. They had simply refused to rise with it. Some people return not with healing in their hands, but with scripts rehearsed in shadows. They come draped in grief, but their sorrow is hollow, built more from consequence than conviction. They omit the choices that brought them low and highlight only the aftermath, hoping to be seen as victims of misfortune rather than authors of collapse. But the refinement you've undergone has sharpened more than your vision. It's tuned your spiritual senses to frequencies their words cannot fake. The energy they carry speaks before they do. And that energy never lies. There's a weight you feel now, a quiet warning beneath the surface of their smiles. Their stories are carefully constructed to evoke your compassion, but you no longer operate from instinct alone. What they call apology feels more like strategy. Their tone may tremble, but their motives remain unchanged. And you've learned painfully that desperation doesn't make someone safe. In fact, it often makes them more volatile. The ones who returned with flowery remorse revealed their true nature as soon as you didn't offer immediate rescue. That's when the kindness slipped, and the expectation behind their words cracked open. They didn't want reconciliation, they wanted immunity. Their hope was that forgiveness would act like a spiritual loophole, erasing not just what they'd done, but who they'd become. They asked to be embraced without ever demonstrating they were safe to hold. They desired closeness, but without the accountability that transformation demands. And deep down, you knew, true change doesn't arrive on command. It requires a breaking, a rebuilding, a realignment they hadn't begun and didn't plan to. Words, no matter how convincing, couldn't undo what actions had already confirmed. Because once someone proves what they're capable of, you're not dealing with possibilities, you're dealing with patterns. Their betrayal wasn't a fluke. It was a fracture long embedded in their character, only revealed when pressure exposed it. And no amount of time or trouble guarantees that fracture has healed. The same absence of moral backbone that made them easy to manipulate the first time still lingers beneath their surface. Should another moment arise, another temptation, another test, they would bend again. The difference now is, you see it coming. And when they finally faced their truth, it wasn't righteous regret, it was rage disguised as grief. Not because you harmed them, but because you escaped the version of you they felt entitled to control. Their campaign against you was never about justice. It was about containment. And when you broke the mold they had placed around your identity, it triggered something they never prepared to confront. The fear that they never really had power over you to begin with. Their fight wasn't fueled by offense. It was fueled by your refusal to shrink. And once they understood that, the pain wasn't just personal. It was existential.